Hi all. Today we talk a little bit more about banal lordship and especially the relationship between banal lords, so lords of Ban, as I think all of you know what it means. It is this um, um, power that was originally exercised by the Germanic kings over their domains that were conceived to be owned in full property, and that in the High Middle Ages, especially after the spread of what would have eventually informally become the feudal system, it became to be a prerogative also of other lords, the many ones into which by which Carolingian Europe was basically uh, divided, let's say very neutrally. It was a very violent process, and therefore lords were, even during the reconstruction of the royal power, especially during the Low Middle Ages, maintained from this very age. So the recognition from these times of their own banal domains, their and their the banal nature of their lordship over certain people, as we will be seeing now. And in fact, this is what we will be talking about: the relationship between banal lords and the essentially the freemen, and therefore that process of subordination that the latter increasingly suffered from the former. And this is a leading topic of high medieval historiography, because this is really how from the base rather than the top, because the top didn't exist at that time, or at least royal power was very weak, and how from the base feudal Europe was actually built. Now obviously the same banal prerogatives were sometimes granted, or at least formally recognized by royal power, but we're not gonna talk about this longer than necessary. I think this is gonna be a very long video. I think we can start from a concept that might sound disconcerting in many ways, but that is basically the core of banal lordship, and it is the fact that the ban basically implied the submission of juridically free men. This was really the point. We arrived in a time in European history, that is the High Middle Ages, in which slavery conceived in ancient terms. I mean, the juridical existence of slaves was essentially fading. And therefore feudal Europe that emerged from these largely Germanic, at least from a juridical point of view, society, um, obviously implied that the majority of people was free. Since in the Romano-Germanic countries there could be slaves or non-freemen, at least at the beginning, when the relative German or so-called German people arrived on the local population and enslaved formally everyone. But over the early medieval centuries, these differences had vanished in a certain sense. It was more than else, the Germanic society paradoxically lifted in a way the same condition of the former slaves that existed, for instance, in the Roman a Roman society and Roman law that in fact that contemplated slavery as as a juridical status. It was very important. And the paradox here at the end of Carolingian Europe and onwards is that the majority of people who actually came to be subjected to the local lords, independently whether we're talking about ban or not, were usually freemen. Also because the ban implied in a certain measure that there was the contraction of an agreement. I mean, the ban wasn't really something born out of, of mere, I'm the lord and whoever lives in around me is my serf. Didn't work like that. There was a lot of active construction of this process. Sometimes it was even asked by the local communities who wanted the lord's protection, and this is how we know it very well, but we're talking about people who were juridically free and capable of accept these agreements. And in fact we're not talking about the progressive transformation from freemen to serfs. And when we talk about serfs that were contemplated in this banal lordship, we don't have to think rather as serfs as as a personal serf of the Lord, the faithful guy who appears so much in historical cinema, that is always follows, I don't know, either the Lord and later the knight. But we're talking about people who became serfs de facto or even juridically, so formally, because they lived into an area that had become subjected to the a certain lord. Excuse me for coughing, but I don't know why. I'm actually healthy. It's just that after dinner, I don't know, I have to drink on it. Excuse me. Here we go. Forgive me for the annoying sound. And therefore, what I meant by that is that there are various ways in which the seigneurial rule was was operating, and usually from a manualistic point of view, we have essentially three categories of banal of relationship between lord and subjected and subjects within the banal relationship. First of all, there is the rights of census and of other services that were owed to the owner of certain land for in a strictly economical sense. Then we have the powers connected with the protection of a territory, and by last the powers that were inherent to the personal bondage of a lord and his own serfs, and even other people like their clients. So here it comes back, the presence of formerly freemen, and therefore however, in spite of their origin, of all those people who became, according to an ancient term of Roman origin, the familia, that is essentially the family, we can translate that, of the Lord. Obviously not the family from a biological point of view, but the family as, people who are familiar, because this is the etymology of familia indeed. Who were in fact called in Latin sources of the Middle Ages the famuli. These are terms that really come back into medieval history very often, and And we must think that we so we have identified these three relationship. First, an economical one. I mean, the idea that you had to work for someone in exchange of something, but it could even be force and force. Think about the corvée. Then broadly military reason or defense reason. The idea that you would be tied to someone because to a lord because he could protect you with his arms against external threats. Could be anything. And third, the a much more intimate relationship that was formed between certain people and Lord at the point that these people were submission to and fidelity to these lords for reasons that for us today as moderns can seem quite strange, but that at the time could mean really something very advantageous in that circumstance, because if you become the trustee of someone very important like a lord, you can even, assure you have maybe you and your family a certain degree of security, a certain income. And let's not forget that many of these people would become in turn lords themselves, because maybe they were entrusted the control of a castle, then the lord died or was wiped out by a war, and instead you had gained a castle that you at least owned, if not formally, at least practically, so you could start your own lordship at that point. This is how this sounds like a joke, but it's really how many important low medieval dynasties actually rose from the ranks, let's say. And I'm very fascinated by this idea of the familia, of the family of the lords. And regarding to that, I would like to read a passage from, or at least make a reference from a diplom of Otto III in 987. So we are even in a late stage of this process that was being formally sanctioned, in fact, by documents like this that talks about a protected and controlled family. The words in Latin are the following: omnis familia servilis e ingenua. It would be et in Latin. That means and, but here you see how medieval Latin is a bit freer from from grammar than classical Latin. But this phrase actually literally means every family, either servile family or free family, and this was referring to German monasteries, in which the king Otto III was assuming the protection, together, in fact, with the one of their own family or familia. And it's interesting that I translated ingenua as free. While there is the other familia who was servilis, so the servile one, and this distinction is very interesting because it shows the degree of of variety that could exist within these relations, and we will get a bit deeper into that in a while, which what does this mean in practice? In practice, it means that these two German monasteries had some relationship with local, obviously with these local peasants, essentially, and these local families that were indeed felt to be so close to the seigneurial power of the monastery. And there were both servile and free families. It means that there were certain family working at the land with certain burdens that were services or other things they had to pay to the monastery, and others were working lands where they didn't have to do. They were there as freemen and even enjoying this privileged status with monastery as family. They didn't have the burdens that the servile family actually had. We are at the end of the 11th century. However, relatively to the tripartite categorization that we made relatively to the economical, military, and familiar relationship there could be within banal relations, we have to say that it's very schematic. It's very concise, and it shouldn't be taken as as something that was so strictly differentiated in practice at that time. What does it mean? Well, it is true that in those times these people actually believed in this tripartition. I mean, it was quite evident that there could be these three different relations that you could have with your own lord in his banal domains. Because it was essentially, if not a juridical, but at least a legal difference. I mean, the practice of how these relations were disciplined, at least theoretically speaking, was quite evident there. But we have to think also one aspect of this is that very often it happened that these seigneurial rights were indeed could exist all three at the same time. You could be under a lord for for economical relations. You just are there not because you're submitted to him for banal reasons, because you need defense, but it could be the case as well, so that you would need seigneurial defense, and therefore he could dispose of some of your rights in exchange for your defense. And obviously these familiar, natural, this personal relation you could have with the Lord himself. And this could happen, by the way, that for peasants in very articulated ways. I mean, you could be a peasant, for instance, who had, I don't know, an economic relation with a lord, a banal relationship, so a military one, a defense one, better say, with another, and still being a famulus of another lord. And this was all the way, in medieval Europe. I mean, it was it happened quite often. It wasn't anything strange. And this tells you how, especially at this very moment, in spite of the progressive loss of freedom by freemen, most of them were still quite, dynamic in deciding who to, follow or to support or ask, help from. And peasant communities were definitely quite active in this sense, and until the low Middle Age, it's not before the low Middle Ages that all European peasantry was basically, or maybe the late Middle Ages, even better, that the European peasantry was essentially wholly subjugated by seigneurial powers. And and this is very important. And yet, as it also happened, it was starting from here that freemen would lose their power. How did it happen in practice? Well, first of all, there could be, here we are talking essentially about dependencies. These peasants found themselves to be dependent on someone in a certain measure, maybe not even a complete one, but definitely they saw convenient. They saw it convenient, unless they were this wasn't enforced on them, to be in a kind of relation with someone. And let's suppose that a peasant would, start an agreement of economical agrarian kind with a lord by saying, I don't know, I want to work, and if you give me one of your lands to go work into, I I will be working them, and that's it. And obviously I have to be faithful to you, and I have to respect certain rules, and part of my income will go to you, etc., so that you can protect me, etc. Um, and, um, and reasons why this peasant could do that as a freeman originally, let's suppose, however, would could be varied, but it could happen that they would lead basically to not being able to come out of that situation anymore, because maybe, I don't know, the political situation worsened, there were wars, there was, a general worsening of certain conditions in that community, etc. So, yeah, you were a freeman by right, but could you really leave that land at a certain point? I mean, where would you go? And that's something that the lords really played on, because they knew that over a long time a certain dependence could be strengthened at the point of making that person losing the personal freedom. And making this guy part of the lord's family, not in the rather personal meaning of the word, but in the one we mentioned above. I mean, meaning the family as, the people who living in a certain area were subjects of that lord. Um, and therefore, this was introduced, this form of subjugation was introduced within the juridically free family. So we would start become demi-Serbs, semi-Serbs, or maybe even Serbs in the end, in practice. And in this process, and it would happen very slowly, telling the truth, most of the times. It wasn't something so sudden, because it was something regulated, especially by economical reasons. The idea that, that lord's power was expanding. This is a moment in which the lordships were building territorial domains and structuring them, and at a certain point you could come out, you couldn't come out anymore. That it was like a black hole. you ended in it. Also because outside that lordship there were other lords who could theoretically even play on you by, making you rise against your lord. But at the same time they could identify you, first of all, as a prey, because your land could be seized, obviously, and you taken out in the process. But it could be that you would be seen as an enemy, because comprehensively you would participate to that community in a way that by, surviving with you and your family, you would still be helping that lord. So what you would lose essentially, very progressively, were various rights, bite by bite, we can say. For instance, the idea of, well, first of all, the mobility. mm, certain contracts, or at least certain agreements, could contemplate the fact that you couldn't go away from that land for a certain time. or that you couldn't really go anywhere else. And this was very often enforced because, working labor force, excuse me, was a very very important thing there. I mean, manpower was the base of agriculture, so you wouldn't like to see as a lord your peasants migrating to someone else's lands, and you would try to keep them under that way. But you could even, for instance, do that by grade, by saying, yeah, you're free to go, but maybe your sons are not. Because you see, you started as a freeman, but your sons were born in my land while you were here, so, they're tied to my land at that point. And what could you do against the Lord? Hmm? You could do something, indeed. You could make a revolt, you could call other nobles, but to other lords to wage war to your noble, but would have it been worth? And especially in a moment in which lords were rising like a military elite, and also an economical, indeed, elite. Was it worth the pain? Was it worth to say, yeah, let's wait another bit, and then remaining always more subjected to that situation, and accepting that certain things would happen? That goes as well with your work. You maybe for having a land you had to work. First of all, that weren't an extraordinary varied things you could do on a land, but you might get that land not to be worked by yourself, obviously, but by working for what the Lord asked you to do, and that wasn't something very light, most of the times, let me tell you. And that could go relatively also to the things your own private goods. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, these peasants, medieval Europe had a very, low rate of economical growth. Essentially, these peasants would work their whole life, and if they were lucky, they would earn something like a 4% of what they had when at the end of their lives, compared to what they had when they had started to work. Yet, these peasant families would obviously have and produce some goods over this land. And the Lord could say, well, you produce those goods by, taking stuff that is on my land, and things you earned are, after all, things that derive from my land. So I can enforce you to, consider those goods as mine, and you can't, for instance, move them. I mean, you can have them because those make you work on my land physically, but you can't sell them. You can't dispose them freely as you like. That was quite usual, and this form of subjugation could arrive until within private affairs, like even the freedom of marrying. Certain peasants weren't free to marry if his own lord didn't decide. And you might think it's something strange or terrible or weird, but if you look at it, it was a big problem. You can't even blame the lords to have such concerns, because if you have a girl there within your peasants, this girl, if she marries, for instance, with someone who lives in another land, she will automatically have to go to live into that other land. So you can't let her do something like that. And as I was saying before, we can't conceive these lordships as, territorially continuous things. So it wasn't a matter of remaining in your own village, isolated from the rest of the world, and yeah, you would intermarry, and essentially, aside from genetic problems, that could be it. We're talking about lordships that were aphysical. that extended over communities that were in contact with many other communities. So if someone wanted to get married, it could be really a loss for a lord to lose one head that you could make taxes being paid. And this was actually an issue. So you understand how many, you know, how deep certain problems were, and practical in nature. We see those times as if there was this kind of hubris and disorder and evil that dominated, but these were actually economical problems. And yeah, there is the the great difference with today, that today we are, at least in our society, juridically free. Those guys weren't, but the problem was there, and it wasn't just about a person who was in love with someone and wanted to marry that someone and go away. It was a matter of that person would go away into some other lord's lands. So it's not that peasants could, you know, peasant feelings could be so so important at that time. It was really a matter of what consequences that brought and who was involved into this process, and who would benefit from that. By the way, we have there was another player into this, and I think it's very interesting to tell, because one of the greater opposers of these problems was the church, because the church always was always there, often behaving like a lordship, but usually trying also to settle things in a way that would, independently from a banal relation, would bring prestige to the same ecclesiastical structure, and therefore having material incomes. And when peasants wanted to marry, very often it was the priests who said, let these guys marry, and do not care whether that girl, by marrying that boy, will go to that boy's house, and the Lord will lose the girl as a service payer and stuff like that. And there would be very intense clashes between the church, the clergy, and lords. There is, I don't remember in which, if it is from Gregory of Tours, saying that at a very early age, because this was happening actually even before the feudal system, that lords would take extreme revenge of killing people just because they wanted to marry, because that would mean that a person would migrate in another place. There was this story of a lord who didn't want a girl to get married with a boy of another land that wasn't his own. And the priest, and he had these, I don't remember the story well, but I mean he wanted to kidnap them or to do something wrong against them. So a priest intervened, and he said, look, promise on the Bible, on the Christian faith, that you will let these two poor youngers marry, because they truly love themselves in front of the Lord. This is the only thing that matters. And this guy would say, I mean, he was asked not to let them separate anymore, and the Lord answered, okay, I swear I will make in a way that they will not be separated anymore. Well, what happened is that this Lord taking literally this oath, took the young boy and the young girl and had them buried alive in a tree trunk, and would bury them under the earth alive. And unfortunately, the priest, knowing this, came with other people to dig them out of the earth, and they managed to take out this trunk, and they found that the boy had survived, but the girl had already died by suffocation. So this tells you how, and I can't say this was everyday's business, because such very violent things would happen very often, but you know there were extremes even for those times standards. But for telling you how important um, these lordships actually were were conceived in the mind of these lords. Um, because it wasn't just a matter of money, it was also a matter of prestige, of reputation. The idea that you had your own banal lordship, so your seigneurial rule had to be undisputed by anyone, because you were like the top guy of the area, and woe to who would you know contrast you, and these things really happened. And therefore, peasants' life in this relationship could arrive to, the lords deciding what you had to do with your wife and with your children, even, um, and even how to use your money, how to transfer your house. We have seen that. And therefore your freedom could be at that point completely annihilated. So it didn't matter that you might have been a freeman at the beginning, you would end basically enslaved. Um, and the problem with that is that with banal lordship is that banal lordship was like the core of the political life at that time. So these banal lordships wouldn't change, essentially, would be inherited, they would be sold, with the ultimate consequence that those who were subjected to it wouldn't see anything changing, or possibly even things getting always worse. And yet, at the same time, you could say within you could see within the seigneurial family proper that there would be non-freemen who, by the services that they had performed and the faithful the loyalty displayed to their lords, would maybe gain freedom, juridically speaking, which is also very fascinating, and even at one point becoming nobles themselves, as we have seen, as it could happen. Um, and as I was saying, this was very much complicated by the fact that we're not talking about lordships that had a compact and mm, coherent territorial organization from a strictly geographical point of view. So these were problems that happen every time with the peasants, because they were within a system of other lordships that could influence their status and their conditions, and that is quite important to remember. And there would be also um, others, ways in how this band could be developed in many ways, because the kings could sometimes be responsible even for formalizing these banal lordships. We won't be explaining why, but it could happen that, for instance, a king would entrust a fiscal court to a certain lord by saying, "Oh, look, lord of this place, you have now, let's take it, the simpler example. I give you this land for reasons that here we don't talk about, and this is a fiscal land, which means that part of this land income has to go to me, king, You work on it, and you have to pay this fiscal, incomes to me, but you have certain rights, certain privileges over these lands and the communities we inhabit them. In more concrete terms, this happened not with the king really giving a lord new land. It could happen, but usually this happened by making a fiscal court, a banal dominion that already existed in practice, and that was a very clever choice, because as a king you could see in your own territory which, you could decide and see who were the more prosperous lords, and by saying, I give you these prerogatives, but you pay me a little bit in money, and both benefited from it, because obviously lords were quite eager to take privileges that were sanctioned by the kings over their relatively to their lordship, and that was definitely a mutual benefit. And one of the major uh, you know prerogatives and rights that you could have was the immunity to do whatever you liked in your own in your own land. Meaning what? Meaning that royal officials couldn't enter your own lands. Do you understand what that means? Is that and this is why I'm telling you how these lords were powerful, and how these lordships would be able to subjugate the local communities. Because if you have an immunity, like the one is called negative immunity, because indeed you couldn't you were not even supposed to exercise justice in your own land. This is called negative immunity, and the royal officers can do anything in your own territory. This means that in your own territory you can do whatever the heck you want. So if you want to slaughter, rape, pillage, and etc., it's not something you would do so lightheartedly in a territory or within a community that you were tied to in economical terms, because obviously the lords weren't really these bloodsuckers that we imagine at a point. There was a great synergy and cooperation between local communities and the local lords. But in many ways, we don't have to idealize it either, as if these guys cared about each other. They wanted obviously to do whatever they liked, and if the balance was in favor of the seigneurial force, you could exercise that force as a lord with impunity in the case of immunity. And soon enough, however, there is to say that relatively to negative immunities, that positive immunity was also and soon granted in this sense. In the sense that with negative immunity, the only way you have to exercise justice in those lands is making the people judged by royal officials. Now, the problem royal officials can't enter in your territory means that in order to do so, you must be you must recur to the next tradition, and this is a problem also with between the king and the lord, because obviously there is immunity about things I do in my own land, but at that point if I have immunity, can people, even if they are king's officials, enter in my own territory? Sometimes things were quite harsh, and especially politically speaking, these ambiguities were quite important in practical policies. But soon enough, there was an idea of positive immunity that kicked in, that was the king saying, okay, we recognize your lordship, but you have to exercise justice there. And the problem in that sense is that you had to do it, and justice obviously is a very big source of income, because fines and other exactions obviously end in great part in the hands of who exercise justice, so the Lord would be happy to do so. But at the same time, probably that would make you know things to be a bit more transparent from the outside, so that if you were someone who had not received justice from a lord, you could still, ask the king, theoretically, or some other institution. That could be a city or another noble, or other, powers that were there to judge. And maybe, and this tells you how chaotic the practice could be, because very often certain juridical matters, especially in penal affairs relatively to violences and raids and stuff like that, where could be, quite easily instrumental to to damage someone. So if you were an external lord in competition with the lord that was judging maybe some of your guys entering in your land, and with the in his land, and making bad things with the cooperation of local peasantry, that would, the who exercised justice was obviously something that really mattered, and who judged in the first place could really solve a lot of matters at his own benefit. And this was done obviously also for the kings, not to let these banal relation becoming the excuse for his own vassals to do whatever they liked. So as you see, it's something very it's very difficult. And another difficulty that could arise within this very complicated scenario is that there could be a competition, and this was also another very important tool for kings, especially to shift the balance of power on a local scale, is that the creation of a fiscal court, so a public good in practice, and public institution within a certain lordship, could be used to contrast the rise of other lordships that maybe were expanding, maybe in the territories where that fiscal court was being created, and that therefore would create a lot of problems, because maybe the guy the lord to which that royal court was entrusted was a weaker lord than the other guy, growing a territorial dominion. And that could serve to, make the public as weak as it was during this period, to contrast with other, powers of, very spontaneous and private nature, that yet were getting to be extremely powerful at a local or even regional scale. And this competition really could take many other paths, so I think we should stop there. So I hope it was clear to you more or less what I was talking about. I think banal lordship is something of great importance for understanding high medieval history. You can't really do without. But a greater importance has the idea of conceiving the whole medieval power in very different terms to what we are used to do today, or maybe today we are used to that a little more compared to maybe one generation or two generations ago. I mean, the idea that there is an overlapping there are overlapping authorities. I mean, there is the idea that you can expand at many levels, not just under the formally public one, but that you can, in order to get effective power, you can take many paths, you can apply many strategies and carry out very subtle policies in order to reach what is ultimately a concrete result that even a public power can fail to achieve. And this is what was happening at this very time. I thank you very much for listening. If you like this video, please share it or subscribe to my channel for receiving further content, or leave a like. And as always, I invite you to comment or to write me via email if you have any question, any curiosity. And I thank you again, and I wish you a very nice time, and see you next time. Bye.